Prisley, and today I'll present about introduction and what and why fraud occur. So first, let's look into what is fraud investigation, why it is being conducted, and who will conduct fraud investigation. First, let's take a look at what is fraud investigation, why it is being conducted, and who will conduct fraud investigation. Fraud investigation is the practice of using accounting and investigative skills to assist in determining whether a criminal matter have occurred in a company. Fraud investigation review and investigate suspicions of fraud and unethical behavior by employees or third parties. An early response to reported fraudulent activities can reduce financial and reputation damage to the company. There are multiple reasons as to why a company conduct a fraud investigation. The trigger will vary depending on the type of fraud. Some common type of fraud includes insurance fraud, corporate fraud, financial fraud, identity theft, internet fraud, corporate slip and fall, expense claim fraud, and theft of inventory. Common signs of frauds includes a sudden large purchase or withdrawals, numerous chargebacks or purchase disputes, customer complaints, and changes in account details such as password and authorized use. Fraud investigation is usually done by Bank Negara Malaysia (BNM) and the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission (MACC). Now let's take a look at how and why fraud occur in an organization. In order to prevent, detect, and investigate fraud, it is important to understand why and how people commit fraud in the first place. Knowing this will help the management of an organization to create policies and internal control to reduce the occurrence of fraudulent behavior in the company. The how and why of fraud could be explained using the fraud triangle. The fraud triangle is a metaphorical diagram that assists in understanding fraud. The concept states that there are three components that lead to fraudulent behavior, which is motive or pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. The opportunity element is the circumstances that allows a fraud to take place. Without this element, fraud will not happen. This perceived opportunity will arise if the business has poor accounting control, not independent internal audit department, lack of clear moral direction from senior management, and complacency. For example, a lack of moral direction from senior management will indirectly tell the employee of the company that it is okay to commit fraud because someone at the upper management is doing the same thing. Another key element of fraud is a perceived financial need in the part of the perpetrator. It is the reason why they commit the fraud. There is no limit to the reason as to why a person will commit a fraud. It could be greed, personal financial pressure, or addiction to gambling. It is in human nature to be greedy when they see a chance to make a fast money. Pressure from financial problem could also be their motive, such as medical expenses for a sick family member. Rationalization of committing fraud is the hardest to understand as it happens in the head of the perpetrator. These elements include fabricating moral excuse to justify their activity. The perpetrator may see their act of doing fraud as something that is not illegal and not wrong from their stand of view. The perpetrator may see themselves as honest and not as criminal, so they come up with excuse to justify their acts such as I will pay this back and no one will know. Some may have abandoned their moral code entirely.
My name is Nurizatul Azira binti Nasir, and I'm going to present about the impact and the consequences of the fraudulent. According to investigations, the consequences of manipulated financial information are enormous. Fraud was obviously giving a bad impression to the company that are committed the fraudulent. When a company is caught red-handed committing fraud, it faces a numerous consequences, including disruption of corporate operations, additional time spent, and damage to the organization's reputation. Another established fact is that legal sanctions cannot fully account for the losses suffered by the firm accused of misconduct. It has been demonstrated that, in addition to legal sanction, the loss of a company's reputation plays a significant role in the company's punishment. The fines, fees, or penalties that the company is required to pay are referred to as legal sanctions. Karpov and Lott conducted the first thorough investigation on corporate fraud in year 1993. After analyzing 132 cases of corporate fraud in the US market, they discovered that in comparison to legal penalties, organizations accused of fraud suffer greatly from reputational damages. Only 6.5% of company losses can be attributed to court-imposed costs, while penalties account for 1.4%. The rest, or more than 90%, can be attributed to reputational losses. For the additional time spent, if an employee is caught committing fraud, the process requires him or her to be away from the office for an extended period of time during the investigation, resulting in a shortage of manpower. The company must continue to pay employees' salary while another person takes over his or her job. According to Carrade 2009, even when companies report fraud cases to external authorities, such as the police, it takes a while for the cases to be investigated and prosecuted. As a result, the company loses money, assets, and reputation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Romina Ana Ujai, and now I will proceed with the next part of our presentation, where I will explain how fraud investigations are related to internal audit function. Internal audit functions are related to fraud investigation in terms of assisting in the deterrence of fraud by examining and evaluating the adequacy and effectiveness of internal controls. In addition, they may assist management in establishing effective fraud prevention measures by knowing the organization's strengths and weaknesses and providing consulting expertise. There is a clear distinction between internal auditors and specialists in fraud investigation, both from the point of view of their roles and responsibilities, as well as in the case of their professional training and specialty. The role of the internal auditor depends, of course, on his professional training and practical abilities as well. The internal audit cannot completely prevent fraud, but it can adapt its work method and procedures so that it can increase the chances to identify and correctly interpret the signs of fraud. The internal auditors must have a superior level of theoretical knowledge and practical experience in order to successfully accomplish their role. They must know the possible fraud scheme and scenario that are specific to an organization field of work, for example, insurance, retail, communications, and so on. And they have to be able to recognize the sign of a possible fraud scheme. If internal audit is required to investigate fraud, the internal auditor should have the necessary skills and experience to undertake the investigation and discharge their professional responsibility without jeopardizing the investigation and associated evidence. From those presented above, we can draw an opinion that all entities need internal audit for business efficiency in the sense of a good management of its patrimony, of reducing costs while maximizing profit, and of achieving medium and long-term objectives. The internal audit cannot completely prevent fraud, but it can adapt its work method and procedures so that it can increase the chances to identify and correctly interpret the signs of fraud. That's all from me. Now we'll pass the next presentation to the next presenter. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Danush Kiramitanudin. So next, I will present internal auditors' role and contribution in fraud investigation. Therefore, there are 5 roles and contribution of internal auditor in fraud investigation. The first one is consider the presence of fraud risk and examine how organizations manage the fraud. Second, alert that fraud will occur in the organization. Next, ensure the effectiveness of internal control and fraud risk management. Help the management to identify the essential indicator of fraud scheme that occur in the organization. And the last one is examine the weakness in the internal control during progression of fraud investigation. Firstly, consider the presence of fraud risk and examine how organizations manage the fraud. It should consider where fraud risk is present within the business and respond appropriately by auditing the control area, evaluating the potential for the occurrence of fraud, and how the organization manage the fraud risk, which is stated in the standard 2120 through risk assessment and audit planning. Internal audit is not directly responsible for preventing fraud within the organizations. Internal auditor should not be expected to have the skill of someone whose sole responsibility is the investigate fraud. Such investigations are best carried out by persons who have prior expertise with such tasks. Internal audit should apply its expertise to analyze data set in order to identify trend and pattern that may indicate fraud or funding abuse. If adequate knowledge or expertise is not available within the internal audit team, the business should consider recruiting or engaging resources with the necessary knowledge or skill. The organization should have an anti-fraud response strategy in place that detail essential rules and investigation procedure. When there is suspected fraud and related control failure, the strategy should spell out the function of internal audit. Next, alert the fraud will occur in the organizations. An internal auditor may help the fraud by investigating and assessing the efficacy of internal control. Internal auditor may be responsible for aiding management in building effective fraud preventions in order to assess the organization's strengths and weaknesses and give advising skill. Furthermore, ensure the effectiveness of internal control and fraud risk management. Internal auditors are in charge of fraud risk management, which include investigations into suspected fraud, root cause analysis, and control improvement suggestions. When fraud occur, internal auditors should investigate how the control failed and recommend areas for improvement. It should analyze the likelihood of more mistake, fraud, or non-compliance throughout the company and reassess the cost of assurance in proportions to possible costs. The internal auditor must ensure that they have appropriate expertise and competence to undertake the investigation, which include understanding of fraud scheme, investigate laws and technology. Another role of an internal auditor in fraud investigation is help the management to identify the essential indicator of fraud scheme that occur in the organizations. For example, red flag fraud refers to unfavorable event or setting that frequently lead to resources fraud, waste, and violence. As a result, the internal auditor must guarantee that the internal audit will aid management in identifying fraud in the organizations. Last but not least, examine the weaknesses in internal control during progression of fraud investigation, as the internal auditor may evaluate the organization's financial record, which is a substantial duty that demand the internal auditor's professional expertise. Forensic investigation can be carried out to discover the effect of a criminal and present it in a manner that can hold up in a court of law.
A very wonderful day I bid to Mr. Patrick. My name is Iza Atira binti Norman. Now I will proceed with the challenges of internal auditor in investigating fraud. The first challenges that the internal auditors face is perceived personal threats. The internal auditors perceive personal threats when they report high level of fraud risk directly to audit committee. As a result of the internal auditor's threat, The fraudster frequently feels empowered by their actions. The personal threat consists of threat to personal security, being threatened on termination from employment, and peer isolation and extortion. Next, lack of professional skepticism. Professional skepticism consists of two, which are skeptical mindset and skeptical attitude. A skeptical mindset refers to cognitive process that understands the issue, gather the facts, and perform an analysis. Meanwhile, a skeptical attitude is a judgment process based on cognitive and effective evaluation. Lack of professional skepticism also leads auditor to decrease the ability to detect fraud errors, run less relevant procedure in detecting fraud, and negatively influence auditor fraud detection performance. The third challenge is the fraudster take advantage from inexperienced internal auditors. Nowadays, most of the audit firms is depending on the inexperienced internal auditors to conduct the major component in completing the audit process. The inexperienced internal auditors usually are unable to decide any kinds of question that will challenge the management decision and should be asked to them. Moreover, the internal auditor with poor skill and inexperience might have difficulties in recognizing the suspicious transaction and counterfeit documentation. In consequence, the fraudster can suit the busy auditor by falsifying the document and other paperwork. The fourth challenge is the organizational barriers. No matter how competent and skillful are the internal auditors, their professionalism and overall performance still depend on the top management as they still work internally within the organization. The internal auditors may be uniquely positioned in the organization, but they still need to follow the same rule as other employees in the organization. The ethical values among the employees in the organization rely on the integrity of the top management. Lastly, the budget and time constraint. The internal auditors also required to specific financial deadlines during the investigation. The tight project deadlines and constraint of resources lead to audits not being as detailed as planned. The time constraint also will impact the task performance and decision quality during the fraud investigation.
My name is Noanisa binti Ali and I will continue the presentation with how internal auditor help to investigate fraud. As internal auditors are among the employee of the organization, therefore it will be easier for them to detect any fraud in the organization. Internal auditor is not qualified to investigate fraud in the organization as their judgment might be biased. However, internal auditor still can assist when there is fraud investigation is going on in the organization. In helping fraud investigation, internal auditor needs to determine the most effective method to be used in detecting fraud. In 1995, Moyes and Baker discovered that the use of effective techniques in auditing will help in detecting weak internal control of the organization and existence of potential fraud. This can be proven by using WorkCom case. In WorkCom case, the internal auditor able to obtain evidence by examining the financial statements secretly. The other way internal auditor can help fraud investigation is by assisting in collecting data and evidence. Internal auditor is familiar with the organization, therefore they may help fraud investigation by collecting suitable and appropriate data for the investigator. There are three types of information that can be collected, which is electronic information, physical information, and human information. Apart from collecting data as evidence, internal auditor also can help fraud investigation by assist in interviewing individuals such as witnesses and facilitating personnel. Internal auditor has been a colleague with the employees in the organization for a long term, which is adequate enough for them to know the character of the employee. Therefore, internal auditor can help investigator to appoint suitable individuals to be interviewed. Apart from that, internal auditor may help by monitoring the employee in an organization.
In order to advising management, internal auditor may assist investigation by monitoring the investigation process to help the organization follow the relevant policies, procedures, and applicable laws and statutes. In conclusion, every business transaction comes with a risk of fraud. Even when an organization has implemented adequate internal controls, fraud can still be occur. Usually, majority of fraud was discovered internally. According to a 2013 KPMG survey, internal control is the most common detection method, followed by internal auditor review and employee notification, whistleblowing mechanisms, and tips from the external parties. Amazingly, fraud can also be discovered when a company changes the personnel on duty. As internal auditors are part of an organization, they play an important role in assisting with fraud investigation. Firms that conduct excellent fraud investigation can effectively provide anti-corruption services, achieve outstanding organizational goals, and potentially gain the trust of the stakeholders.